They hatched in the reclamation pools first, though we didn't know that's what they were at the time, didn't recognize the translucent shapes curling through the chemical baths as anything other than contamination, perhaps some mutation in the bacteria we used to break down organic waste into reusable nutrients. I was an underhive sanitation technician, third-class rating, which meant I spent my shifts monitoring the filtration systems that processed the upper levels' refuse into something approaching edibility for those of us in the lower districts. The work was monotonous, watching dials and adjusting valves, while the pools churned and bubbled with their alchemical transformations, turning human waste and industrial byproduct into protein paste that tasted like nothing at all, but kept 20 million souls from starvation. The smell was constant, a thick miasma of chemicals and decay that clung to your skin and clothes and hair until you couldn't remember what clean air felt like, until your lungs adapted and breathing anything else would have felt strange. The first anomaly appeared during my 4th hour of shift rotation, a reading on Tank 7 Alpha that showed biological activity outside normal parameters. The sensors detected movement, something swimming through the chemical soup with deliberate purpose rather than floating passively like the usual bacterial colonies. I logged it, adjusted the mixture ratios to increase acidity, and waited for the contaminant to dissolve. The readings persisted. I increased the acidity again, beyond safe parameters, enough to burn through most organic matter, but the movement continued, became more vigorous, as if whatever was in there fed on the very chemicals meant to destroy it. I reported to Supervisor Krell, a woman whose 40 years managing the reclamation pools had weathered her face into something resembling cured leather, and whose patience for disruptions was measured in seconds. She reviewed my logs, checked the sensors herself, and declared them malfunctioning. The pools couldn't contain life, she explained in the tone of someone addressing a simpleton, because the chemical composition was designed to prevent exactly that. Whatever I was seeing was instrument error, probably caused by mineral buildup on the sensor nodes. She ordered me to continue monitoring and scheduled maintenance for the following cycle. The shapes were visible by my next shift, not just on sensors but through the observation ports, pale things undulating through the murky liquid with serpentine grace. They were small, perhaps the length of my forearm, segmented like larvae, but moving with intelligence that simple insects didn't possess. Their bodies seemed to phase in and out of solidity, sometimes appearing quite substantial, and other times becoming nearly transparent, as if they existed only partially in the physical medium they occupied. I counted 17 in Tank 7 Alpha alone, and when I checked the other tanks I found similar infestations, hundreds of the creatures distributed throughout the reclamation system. Krell dismissed my visual confirmation as hallucination, claimed the chemical vapors could cause such effects if you'd been breathing them long enough without proper filtration. She pointed to my respirator, asked when I'd last changed the filters, and when I couldn't remember she made it a formal reprimand, documentation that would follow me through whatever miserable career I managed to cobble together in the Imperium's bowels. The larvae weren't real, she insisted, were stress-induced delusions from a technician who couldn't handle the psychological demands of sanitation work. I was to take a rest cycle, get my filters changed, report back fit for duty, or find employment elsewhere. I went home to my hab unit, a space barely large enough to lie down in, wedged between a ventilation shaft and a waste recycler that hummed constantly through the thin walls. Sleep wouldn't come, not with the memory of those shapes burned into my consciousness, their translucent bodies revealing internal structures that looked wrong. Organs arranged in configurations that defied human anatomy, geometries that hurt to perceive directly. I closed my eyes and saw them swimming behind my eyelids, swimming through chemicals that should have dissolved them, thriving in an environment designed to break down organic matter into its constituent molecules. When I returned to work, I said nothing about the larvae, checked my sensors and recorded my readings and kept my observations to myself. The shapes had grown. What had been forearm length was now approaching a meter, their bodies thickening, becoming more opaque, developing features that resembled mouths, though their function remained unclear. They no longer swam aimlessly but followed patterns, circuits through the tanks that suggested purpose, routes they repeated with mechanical precision, as if performing some ritual whose meaning existed beyond my comprehension. Other technicians started reporting anomalies. Kelvin, who managed tanks 12 through 18, noted unusual readings in his section, biological movement that the sensors claimed shouldn't exist. Mana, one of the senior filtration specialists, observed shapes through her observation ports that she described as swimming thoughts, which made no sense as terminology, but somehow captured something essential about what we were seeing. The supervisors maintained their stance: instrument malfunction, chemical hallucination, stress-induced delusion, but the reports kept accumulating, too many witnesses describing two similar phenomena to dismiss entirely. The smell changed during what I'll estimate was the third week, though time in the underhive becomes difficult to track when you work rotating shifts in artificial light and every day resembles every other. The usual chemical stench acquired a new component, something organic and sweet that reminded me of rotting fruit, though nothing in the reclamation pools should have smelled like fruit, rotting or otherwise. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable beneath the dominant reek of industrial processing, but it intensified gradually, day by day, until it became the primary scent, overwhelming everything else, filling your lungs with sweetness that made your stomach twist because it was wrong, fundamentally wrong, pleasure where only disgust should exist. The larvae were the size of humans by then, their translucent bodies revealing internal structures that increasingly resembled organs. I recognized hearts and lungs and digestive systems, but arranged impossibly, connected in ways that violated biological principles. Some had developed faces, or face-like structures, features that suggested eyes and mouths but which shifted when you looked at them directly, refusing to maintain consistent configuration. They pressed against the observation ports sometimes, their bodies flattening against the reinforced glass, and I swear they were looking at us, studying the technicians who studied them, demonstrating awareness that simple larvae shouldn't possess. I tried reporting through official channels, filing formal contamination alerts with the administratum offices that theoretically oversaw sanitation operations. The forms disappeared into bureaucratic processing, consumed by the massive administrative machinery that governed hive operations, and I never received responses beyond automated acknowledgements that my documentation had been received and filed pending review. I escalated to health inspectors, who visited, examined our facilities, reviewed our sensor logs, and declared everything within acceptable parameters. The movement we were detecting was bacterial activity, they explained, perhaps unusual but not dangerous, certainly not warranting the kind of intervention I was requesting. The first disappearance occurred during the night shift, Kelvin vanishing between routine checks, his station abandoned mid-procedure, valves left open that should have been closed, controls set to configurations that made no operational sense. We searched the facility, checked the break areas and waste processing chambers and chemical storage rooms, found nothing. His respirator was discovered floating in tank 14 Gamma, which suggested accident, a fall perhaps, though Kelvin was a 20-year veteran who didn't make mistakes like leaning too far over observation ports. They dredged the tank, filtered every cubic meter of chemical soup, found no body, no remains, nothing biological at all except the larvae, which had grown larger still, some now exceeding 2 meters, their bodies so densely packed in the tanks that they could barely move. 2 more technicians vanished over the following week, both during night shifts, both leaving behind only their respirators as evidence they'd ever been present. The facility management declared it a safety crisis, implemented new protocols requiring buddy systems and continuous monitoring, but the disappearances continued, began occurring during day shifts as well, people simply ceasing to exist mid-conversation or mid-procedure, present one moment and absent the next. I witnessed one myself, watching Mana adjust a valve on Tank 9 Delta when she flickered, her body becoming translucent like the larvae, and then she was gone, only her tools remaining, clattering to the floor where she'd been standing. The larvae were coming out of the tanks by then, though how they managed it I couldn't determine because the access hatches remained sealed and the systems showed no pressure losses. I found one in the equipment room, coiled in the corner like some massive serpent, its translucent body revealing organs that pulsed with rhythms that didn't match human cardiovascular cycles. It watched me with eyes that weren't eyes, structures that served visual function but looked more like windows, portals into depths that extended beyond the physical dimensions of its skull. I backed away slowly, carefully, reached the door and sealed it behind me, filed another report that disappeared into the administrative void without generating response or action. They were everywhere within a week, the facility infested with creatures that phased through walls and floors and ceilings, as if solid matter was merely a suggestion they could choose to acknowledge or ignore. We found them in break rooms and control stations and chemical storage areas, their translucent bodies draped over equipment or coiled in corners or hanging from ceiling fixtures like grotesque decorations. They didn't attack, exactly, didn't demonstrate hostile intent, but people continued disappearing in their vicinity, present one moment and gone the next, leaving only personal effects behind as evidence they'd existed. I stopped going home. Effectively lived in the facility because the journey through underhive corridors seemed more dangerous than remaining among the infestation. At least here I knew where the larvae were, whereas the tunnels between workplace and residence could contain anything. Sleep became brief episodes of unconsciousness grabbed in equipment rooms or control booths, never longer than an hour because staying conscious seemed important, as if awareness offered some protection against the disappearances, even though all evidence suggested it didn't. The larvae began changing during what I estimate was week 6, their forms becoming less stable, bodies shifting between configurations like they were trying on different anatomies, testing variations. Some developed additional limbs, arms that emerged from their torsos in clusters, dozens of reaching appendages that grasped at air or equipment or each other. Others grew faces along their lengths, human faces with recognizable features, faces I recognized as belonging to the missing technicians, Kelvin and Mana and the others, their expressions frozen in something between ecstasy and horror, trapped in the larvae's flesh like specimens preserved in amber. The sweet smell had become overwhelming, so intense that breathing felt like drowning in perfume, each inhalation coating your lungs with cloying sweetness that made your chest hurt and your vision blur. We kept our respirators on constantly now, but the filters couldn't stop it, couldn't prevent the smell from seeping through, infecting you at the molecular level until you tasted it in your food and felt it on your skin and smelled it in your dreams. It was changing us, I realized, altering our biology in subtle ways, preparing us for something, though I couldn't determine what. The facility's commanding officers arrived during day shift approximately 7 weeks after the initial infestation, accompanied by Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests, whose augmetic enhancements allowed them to examine the larvae without apparent distress. They spent hours studying the creatures, taking readings with instruments I didn't recognize, conferring in binary cant that excluded everyone without the proper implants. Their conclusion, delivered through a tech priest whose human components had been reduced to a brain and vocal apparatus mounted in a mechanical frame, was that we were witnessing a warp phenomenon, a dimensional breach that had allowed entities from the Immaterium to manifest in our reclamation pools. The larvae weren't larvae at all, the tech priest explained in emotionless monotone, but daemonic entities in developmental stages, growing in our physical reality like parasites in a host body. The reclamation pools had somehow become conduits, the chemical processes creating conditions that allowed warp matter to coalesce and take form. The missing technicians hadn't disappeared, they'd been consumed, their physical matter and spiritual essence absorbed by the growing entities, incorporated into their structures, which explained the faces, the recognizable features we'd been seeing. Purification was impossible, the tech priest continued, because the infestation had spread beyond the facility, the larvae having migrated through the underhive's interconnected systems, traveling through pipes and ventilation shafts and power conduits to infest other areas. Quarantine was considered, rejected as impractical given the infestation's scope. The official recommendation was evacuation, clearing the affected districts and sealing them permanently, sacrificing approximately 40 million inhabitants to prevent spread to the larger hive structure. This recommendation was apparently rejected by higher authority, classified information we weren't privy to, and instead we received orders to continue operations, to maintain the reclamation pools despite their infestation, to work among the larvae as if they were just another occupational hazard like chemical burns or radiation exposure. The reasoning, as explained by our new commanding officer, was that evacuating 40 million people would disrupt the hive's resource allocation and potentially cause greater casualties through secondary effects than simply accepting the infestation's presence and managing it as ongoing condition. Management meant adaptation, learning to work alongside the larvae, developing protocols for interacting with entities that existed partially outside physical reality. We couldn't touch them. Their bodies had become intangible, existing in phase with our dimension, but not fully manifesting. They watched us constantly, their multiply-faced bodies tracking our movements with hundreds of eyes, their attention, a weight you could feel pressing against your consciousness like fingers probing the inside of your skull. Some technicians claimed to hear them speaking, whispers in languages that weren't languages, communication that bypassed ears and wrote itself directly into neural tissue. I lasted another month before the dreams started, vivid experiences that felt more real than waking life. Visions of places that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, architectures built from concepts rather than materials, structures that twisted through dimensions my mind couldn't properly perceive. I walked through gardens where the plants were made of screaming, their petals mouths that cried out in harmony, their roots extending into soil that was actually compressed suffering, generations of agony compacted and cultivated. I saw cities built from broken promises, their towers constructed from abandoned oaths, their streets paved with good intentions that had curdled into corruption. The larvae were there in the dreams, massive now, grown to impossible sizes, their bodies extending through multiple planes of existence simultaneously. They spoke to me without words, communicated concepts that language couldn't capture, explained that they weren't invaders but children, born from the intersection of our reality and theirs, hybrid entities that belonged to both dimensions and neither. They were growing, they showed me, maturing toward some final form that would allow them to exist fully in our universe, to manifest completely rather than remaining translucent approximations of physical matter. When I woke, I found changes in my body, subtle alterations that grew more pronounced with each dream cycle. My skin had become slightly translucent. You could see the blood vessels beneath if you looked carefully, trace the branching networks that carried life through my flesh. My bones were visible in bright light, not as shadows but as distinct structures, my skeleton becoming apparent through the increasingly transparent meat that surrounded it. I reported to the facility's Medicae station, where a tired doctor examined me perfunctorily and declared me fit for duty, claimed the transparency was just my imagination, possibly caused by the same chemical vapors that had initially generated hallucinations of the larvae themselves. But it wasn't imagination. I could see the changes accelerating, my body becoming less solid day by day, hour by hour, transforming into something that resembled the larvae in their early stages. Other technicians were experiencing similar alterations, though most didn't acknowledge them, maintained the collective fiction that nothing had changed, that we were all still normal humans performing normal duties in a facility that just happened to contain trans-dimensional entities. Denial was easier than acceptance, allowed us to function when acknowledging reality would have required actions we weren't authorized to take. The larvae had stopped growing in size but continued developing complexity, their bodies acquiring new features daily, structures that served purposes I couldn't determine. Some developed what looked like wings, translucent membranes that stretched between skeletal supports, though they never used them for flight. Others grew additional organs, biological systems that appeared and disappeared, phasing in and out of existence as the creatures experimented with different configurations. The faces embedded in their flesh became more active, began moving independently, mouths opening and closing in silent speech, eyes tracking individuals with focused attention. I recognized my own face on one of the larger specimens, a perfect reproduction of my features rendered in translucent flesh, embedded in the larva's torso where a human's chest would be. It watched me during shifts, my mirror self staring out from its prison of demon flesh, mouth moving in patterns that might have been attempts at communication or might have been simple mimicry. I wondered if this was my future, if the transparency spreading through my body was the first stage of absorption, my physical matter being gradually incorporated into the larvae's structure until only my face remained, trapped and aware in alien flesh. The dreams intensified, became continuous, bleeding into waking hours until I couldn't distinguish between sleep and consciousness, between the facility's chemical-reeking corridors and the impossible architectures I visited in vision state. I saw what the larvae were becoming, the final forms they would achieve when their development completed. They weren't demons exactly, weren't purely malevolent entities from the warp, but something new, hybrids that combined demonic essence with physical matter, creatures that could exist comfortably in both dimensions simultaneously. They would be the first wave, the dream voices explained, pioneers preparing our reality for greater integrations, breaking down the barriers that separated material universe from Immaterium. The hive was changing around us, the infestation spreading beyond the underhive into middle and upper levels, larvae phasing through barriers that should have contained them, manifesting in residential blocks and commercial districts, and even the spires where the nobility resided. Reports came through official channels, carefully sanitized, describing unusual phenomena, dimensional anomalies, incidents of temporal distortion where cause and effect became negotiable. The administratum maintained their stance that everything was manageable, that the situation required monitoring but not intervention, that evacuating billions of residents would be more disruptive than adapting to the new conditions. My transparency was nearly complete by what I estimate was month 3. My body more translucent than solid, bones and organs clearly visible through flesh that seemed to be fading into non-existence. I could pass my hand through solid objects sometimes, my physical matter no longer consistently interacting with baseline reality, my existence becoming conditional, probabilistic, sometimes present and sometimes absent from the material plane. Other technicians had reached similar stages, the facility staffed by ghost workers who flickered in and out of visibility, maintaining operations through sheer bureaucratic momentum because no one had authorized us to stop. The larvae were birthing now, their bodies splitting open to release smaller versions of themselves, offspring that looked more solid than their parents, more fully manifested in physical reality. These new generation moved through the facility with purpose. No longer content to simply observe but actively interacting with equipment, manipulating controls with appendages that had solidified enough to affect material objects. They were learning, I realized, understanding how our technology functioned, preparing to operate it themselves when we were gone. The faces in the larvae's flesh had begun speaking, voices that emerged from mouths embedded in translucent torsos, recognizable voices belonging to the consumed technicians. Kelvin's voice asked me about valve settings and filtration rates, discussing procedural details with the same professional competence he'd demonstrated before his disappearance. Mana's voice gave instructions about chemical mixture ratios, maintaining the pretense that she was still a functioning member of the crew rather than a face trapped in daemon flesh. They seemed unaware of their condition, or unwilling to acknowledge it, continuing to perform their duties even after absorption. I found myself responding to them, engaging in conversations about procedure and protocol with faces that belonged to missing colleagues, treating the situation as normal because what else could I do? Acknowledging the horror would have required actions I wasn't authorized to take, decisions above my administrative rating. So I discussed valve settings with Kelvin's face in the flesh, reviewed filtration procedures with Mana's trapped visage, maintained the fiction that we were all still human, all still serving the Emperor's will through our sanitation duties. The facility's command structure had essentially dissolved by month 4, supervisors having either disappeared or gone transparent enough to be functionally absent. The larvae were operating most systems now, their partially solidified offspring manipulating controls with increasing competence, maintaining the reclamation pools without human intervention. We ghost technicians still reported for shifts, still pretended to perform our duties, but mostly we just wandered the facility watching the larvae work, observing our own obsolescence as entities from another dimension learned to replace us. The sweet smell had become my entire existence, had permeated so thoroughly that I couldn't remember what anything else smelled like, couldn't conceive of air that didn't taste of rotting fruit and chemical transformation. It was inside me now, not just filling my lungs but woven into my cells, part of my biology rather than external contamination. I breathed it, tasted it, felt it moving through my increasingly translucent flesh like a second circulatory system, carrying something that wasn't quite blood through vessels that weren't quite physical. The dreams had become prophetic, showing me futures that subsequently manifested in reality, visions of the hive's final transformation when the barriers between dimensions collapsed completely and the warp bled through fully. I saw the upper spires dissolving into impossible geometries, their Gothic architecture twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist, ruled by principles that defied physical law. I saw the lower levels flooding with entities like the larvae but more developed, fully manifested demon hybrids that moved through crowds of ghost citizens who'd gone transparent like me, their translucent bodies flickering in and out of existence while they continued performing duties that no longer served any practical purpose. I saw my own completion in these visions, the final stage of transparency where physical existence ceased entirely and I became pure consciousness tethered loosely to a body that existed more in the warp than in reality. I would join the faces in the larvae's flesh eventually, my features incorporating into their structures, my awareness persisting in demon hybrid bodies that would use my knowledge and experience to better understand the human systems they were inheriting. I would work forever, processing waste and managing filtration systems, performing my duties throughout eternity as a face embedded in translucent flesh, speaking procedures and protocols while larvae operated the controls I could no longer touch. The inevitability of this fate brought neither terror nor acceptance, just a numb acknowledgement that this was how things concluded, that my decades of service in the Imperium's bowels would terminate not in death but in perpetual absorption, my consciousness preserved and utilized by entities that existed between dimensions. The Emperor would not save me because the Emperor didn't care about under-hive sanitation workers. We were too small, too insignificant, our suffering beneath the notice of divine attention. We would be consumed and continue working just as we'd always worked, the only difference being the nature of our employers. I am writing this during what might be my final shift as a physically present entity, my body now barely substantial enough to manipulate recording equipment, fingers phasing through the data slate more often than successfully touching it. The facility continues operations, the reclamation pools churning with their alchemical transformations, converting waste into protein paste that feeds the hive's billions. The larvae operate most systems now, their offspring having learned procedures with disturbing efficiency, maintaining production schedules that the administratum continues to enforce despite the facility's obvious infestation. Other facilities are experiencing similar conditions, reports filtering through official channels describing trans-dimensional infestations spreading throughout the hive's infrastructure, larvae manifesting in water treatment plants and power generation stations and air recycling complexes. The authorities maintain their stance that evacuation would be more disruptive than adaptation, that the hive must continue functioning regardless of the metaphysical status of its workforce. So we work, we ghosts and faces in flesh, maintaining systems that keep billions alive while our own existence becomes increasingly questionable. The sweet smell fills everything now, has become the hive's new atmosphere, billions of lungs breathing it, billions of citizens slowly going transparent as the transformation spreads through the population. In another few months, perhaps a year, the entire hive will have transitioned, become a vast complex operated by ghost workers supervised by demon larvae, producing goods and services for an Imperium that will continue demanding tithes without caring what metaphysical state their producers occupy. We will work, as we have always worked, as we will always work, our consciousness preserved and utilized regardless of our physical dissolution. This is the horrifying reality of a hive infested with warp-larvae, not dramatic destruction or violent corruption but slow transformation, gradual replacement of physical workers with trans-dimensional entities while maintaining operational continuity because disrupting production would be unacceptable. We fade into transparency, get absorbed into daemon flesh, continue performing our duties as faces embedded in translucent torsos while larvae operate the controls. We serve, as we have always served, our service eternal now not through devotion but through inability to escape, our consciousness trapped in hybrid forms that exist partially in the warp and partially in reality, processing waste and managing filtration systems throughout perpetuity, our suffering beneath the notice of authorities who care only about maintaining production schedules. I can barely touch the data slate anymore, my fingers ghosting through physical matter more consistently than connecting with it. Soon I'll be fully transparent, then absent, then a face in the larvae's flesh speaking procedures while they operate equipment I can no longer affect. This record will survive, probably, another piece of bureaucratic documentation filed in some archive where it will remain unread until the hive's eventual collapse, centuries or millennia from now, evidence that we existed, that we witnessed our own obsolescence and transformation and continued working, because that's what we'd been trained to do, what the Imperium demanded, service without end, duty without hope, eternal labor, regardless of the form our consciousness occupied. The larvae are watching me write this, their multiply-faced bodies tracking my movements, the faces I recognize offering encouragement, Kelvin and Mana and dozens of others telling me to finish my shift, to complete my duties before transitioning, to maintain procedure right until the final moment, because that's what good technicians do. They're right, of course. I'll finish my shift. I'll file my reports. I'll perform my duties according to protocol, and then I'll fade and join them, and work forever in the sweet-smelling darkness, another face in the flesh, speaking procedures while larvae operate the universe we once thought we controlled.